everyone. I'm Lois with Aussie Lozzie Knit Designs, and this is Knit Bits. I'm finally back. It feels a lot longer than I think that it was in actuality. I think it was only a week, but it feels like I've been off for, I don't know, a few weeks, and it was only 5 days or something. I guess I really needed that break. But today I'm back, and we're talking about gauge. So gauge is a beast of a topic. It's something that most of us knitters would like to not think about too much. I think most of the time we just wish that we'd automatically get gauge and it wasn't something we had to worry about. But it is. And so to start us off in this series where we talk about gauge, I thought it would be really helpful to define what gauge is to a knitter. And so I've been thinking about this for the last week and a half or so. How would I define gauge for a knitter? And in typical me fashion, I did not look up how others define it. I thought that I needed to come up with it on my own. I don't know why. It actually didn't occur to me to look up what other people said about knitting gauge. That's really silly, but that's the truth. And so I thought about it long and hard. I came up with a definition. And then this morning, my husband was like, did you do research for the definition, like what you're going to say today? And I was like, oh, nope, I didn't. I just made up a definition for myself. So I went online and I did Google how other people define gauge for knitters. And I think that there's strength in the definition that I came up with and with the definition that others use. And so I'm going to tell you them both. And then in the coming knit bits, then we'll talk about different things relating to gauge. Okay, so the way that I defined gauge was it's the amount of space that a stitch takes up. So the amount of space that a stitch takes up. And that is both, horizontal as well as the height. So the row height is what they'd call that. All right, so knitting gauge is the amount of space that a stitch takes up. When I looked online, most people are defining knitting gauge as the number of stitches in a 1 inch, or the number of stitches and rows in 1 inch of fabric, the number of stitches and rows in a 4 by 4 inch square or 10 by 10 centimeter square. And so while I was thinking of gauge in terms of this singular stitch, they were thinking of it in terms of how we use it in knitting, right? To get knitting gauge, it doesn't matter about the individual stitch. It matters the stitches and rows over an amount of space. And that is true. That is very true. But I think that the definition that I came up with empowers us as knitters, because when we think about the individual stitch and how much space that's taking up, well, that gives us a lot more power to change our gauge as we need to. And we'll be talking about that more in the days to come. But I think that if we combine those two definitions, we've got it covered. I did see that some people blend gauge with tension. So they'll say things like, well, knitting gauge is the tension of the knitter. So if you're a tight knitter or a loose knitter. And I do not agree with that definition at all. Actually, I think that it can affect gauge, but I don't think that gauge and tension are the same things. And we can talk more about that in the days to come as well. But so for just today, I think to get us all thinking about gauge and what it really actually means, we can define it as the amount of space that a stitch takes up and the number of stitches and rows that are in a 4 by 4 inch or 10 by 10 centimeter square piece of fabric. And those two combined, I think, is an excellent definition for what knitting gauge is, in case you were wondering. So I will be back tomorrow morning at 8:30, and I lost my notebook temporarily, but I'll find it. And we will talk more about knitting gauge. And it's going to be so fun. So I hope to see you then. Bye-bye.